powers is central to our Constitution. It is emphatically the province and duty of judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. I'm very delighted to introduce Professor Subotnik to our students today. Professor Subotnik worked in investment banking fields before joining the teaching profession in law and business. He taught at various institutions, including Northwestern University, University of Illinois Chicago, Santa Clara University School of Law, Seton University School of Law, and the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business. He has written on a wide range of legal and non-legal topics, including taxation, accounting, torts, gender and race relations, academic research, and the regulation of sexuality. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Subotnik.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is maybe my 35th talk. I may be the old-time leader for the Federalist Society and visits to different law schools. I don't know. But the reason I'm telling you that is I am happiest to be here. And the reason I'm happiest to be here is because this is where I got my start in legal education. Perhaps, although I'm not entirely clear, in this room, I don't know, under the sponsorship of a man who was very close to me, who died last year, Mayor Freed. I came here in about 1980, 81. I taught here for a year or two. And then I moved on, and it's just a thrill to be back here. So thank you, Ms. Wan, and the rest of you for inviting me. I dedicate this talk to the late Professor Mayor Freed. So welcome to whatever we want to call this, learning to talk about race and gender. By the way, did we get the handouts? There's a handout here.
We're waiting for them.
They'll bring it as soon as it's ready.
And they were going to bring it over as soon as
Unfortunately, I need that because I'm going to be making reference to that.
do you want to
See if we can get it. Ms. Wan, the president's job is to tell jokes at this stage.
That is not my forte. Anyone like to volunteer?
We're checking out.
Okay.
I didn't make it. Yes. I'm not that good.
Did any of you know Mayor Freed? No.
They did a reception here.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, a couple days ago.
Died about October, I think on October 1st last year. I think the reception of November, December, or maybe even in January. But I live in New York and I couldn't be here.
Yeah. Was he the dean of the law school at the time?
He wasn't the dean, he was the associate dean for many years. Many, many years. I knew him from his New York days.
What were you doing before coming to the school to teach?
Oh, here it is. Thank you very much. No, I teach now. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I don't know if I'm going to fill in my biography for you.
Great.
I'm going to be making direct reference to these handouts, so please grab a copy. Thank you. copies? All right, thanks, folks. Did you get a copy?
It's coming.
It's going down. All right, a couple of words, couple more words about myself. I teach at Touro Law School. Among other things, I teach a course in race and gender. I'm guessing that Ms. Wan and the rest of the executive committee invited me because, among other things, I published a book in 2005 called Toxic Diversity, Race, Gender, and Law Talk in America. The book was published by NYU and was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal, and I'm sure it's the book is here in your library. I've also written a number of law review articles on race and gender, maybe another dozen or so. So that's where I've kind of staked out my reputation after a number of years in the business area, teaching tax and accounting for lawyers. That's teaching tax. If I didn't mention it, is how I started here. All right, so why do I go on the circuit? One of the reasons is that it's very hard to talk about race, and I think it's my job, I feel personally responsible for raising the issue of race because it's very hard to talk about it. My students tell me on a regular basis that's the case. When I go around the country, the students tell me the same thing. And it seems to me it's a shame, and more than a shame, it's really destructive, terribly destructive, kind of the way we shy away from issues that are of central importance in the society. All the people who are cited here are, let's say, scholars of color. Okay, mostly African Americans, maybe a Caribbean American in there someplace, and a Hispanic and Asian. So I don't want to identify them kind of further by race. So, no Euro-American person except one insensitive to the charge of racism dares say what he or she really means. And we could ask, why is that? Is there perhaps some fear of offending sensibilities? A strange idea in the law school, to be sure, but that's at least a possible argument. Or a possible point, a possible explanation for the absence of dialogue on the subject of race. So let's go to number 2 on the handout. Afro-American and Euro-American persons should treat each other exactly alike. As responsible moral agents, we do not need any special sense of sensitivities. Orlando Patterson is a distinguished sociologist at Harvard. Now, let's turn to number 3. If engagement is the first step in healing, then the second is pure, unadulterated struggle. We will never achieve racial healing if we do not confront one another, take risks, say things we are not supposed to say in mixed company. And now you might be asking me, why am I doing all this? Why am I, and I'm going to continue on this in this vein, kind of laying the groundwork for the central part of my talk. And the reason is it is so hard to talk about race. And I'm anxious for you to see how weird it is that in a place like Northwestern Law School, or any law school for that matter, people are constrained, and I'm saying whites as well as non-whites are constrained in their dialogue on the subject of race. Harlan Dalton is a law professor at Yale. Okay, so we might say, why then is this the case? Why? Let's start with whites. Why is it that whites don't feel comfortable talking about race? And the answer to that is pretty easy, and that is there's a terrible history, including slavery and Jim Crow. we whites have a lot on our collective conscience, and so it stands to reason that we would skirt the issue of race to the extent that our comments on the subject of race were at all critical. And so it's not surprising that race has that power. Now, the guilt on the part of white people has led to a bargain on the subject of dialogue that has been discussed and really developed by by Shelby Steele. Shelby Steele is an African-American professor of history at the Hoover Institution and at Stanford. Steele's argument is as follows. There's been a dialogue that has been developed and ground rules for dialogue, and the ground rules are that blacks are not going to call whites or others racist because of the sensibilities of whites on those subjects, and in response, on the other side, whites are not going to call African Americans ignorant. And you can see the connection. Ignorance was, of course, the foundation of slavery. Slaveries couldn't learn anything. It was a waste of time teaching them anything. Special sensitivities on the subject of ignorance. So that's the bargain, and I think there's something to it, which is why I am mentioning it here. And so the question arises, is this healthy for us? And I suggest the answer is no, for reasons that I'll get to in a minute. But before I do, take a look at the comment by Eric Holder on the bottom of the handout. I don't know if you recall this comment, maybe 2 years ago. It was front pages in the news, but I don't think anybody has referred to it recently. In things racial, we have always been, and we, I believe, continue to be, in too many ways, essentially a nation of cowards. We, average Americans, simply do not talk enough with each other about things racial. If we are to make progress in this area, we must be comfortable enough with one another and tolerant enough of each other to have frank conversations about racial matters that continue to divide us. So, when I speak to African Americans, I ask whether the state of discourse is acceptable. What's the price we pay for the non-discourse, the discourse non-discourse that we have? It is my position, as is Eric Holder's and is Harlan Dalton, we can't get any place unless we put all of this on the table. I don't think that we can live with one another cross-culturally, cross-racially, unless we do put it on the table. I think if a person, and I've thought a lot about this, if I think that I've got to be careful in talking to you, I'm going to avoid you. And if you think you've got to be careful talking about me, you're going to avoid me. It's too risky. And so I accept the challenge by Orlando Patterson to talk on the subject of race, not paying any attention to any special sets of sensitivities. That's in item number 2. Now, I've given this talk, as I think I indicated before, some 30 times. I've never had any problems, so you can take a deep breath, and we'll get through this somehow, I hope. If not, there's always a first time. Okay, now, the bargain has broken down to some extent, and I'm going to give you a specific illustration later on in this talk about how the bargain has broken down. But let me give you a sense of how the bargain works. Let's say that a scholar of color says something dumb. How does anybody else respond? And the problem is, saying that's a dumb thing is too close to saying you're ignorant. Remember, that's the fundamental bargain according to Shelby Steele. There's a very thin line between you're dumb and you're ignorant, and therefore we back off and we don't say you're dumb when somebody in fact says something ridiculous. And so the whites back off on subjects like that, and so you would be right to ask the question, well, what about scholars of color? They're not constrained in the same way. Why can't they keep the discourse honest? And the reason that is the case, or the reason why they can't, is because there is a discipline that is imposed upon conservative scholars of color in the black community. And if you want to get a sense of how painful it is for conservative scholars of color to speak their minds, I urge that you read a book by Randall Kennedy, who's a very distinguished professor of criminal law at Harvard. The name of his book is Sellout. He characterizes himself as having been at the end of charges of himself being a sellout. And I know a number of other conservative scholars who simply will not go out and make comments on the subject of race for fear of taking heat from the black community. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my book. Now, what happens when you don't have discipline coming from the white community? When I say white, I mean everybody else but the black community. And you don't have discipline coming from within the black community, what happens? And I suggest to you, and you probably have understood this already in your studies here, law professors are really no different from 2-year-olds. In this sense, we all need discipline. You know the book, or you've heard of the book perhaps, Everything I Learned in Life, I Learned in Kindergarten. There's some truth to that. That's why it was a bestseller. If I take a position and nobody pushes back, it is absolutely fundamental human nature. It's evolution. It's a basic principle of evolution that I'm going to push forward. And I'm going to push forward, until somebody pushes back. If nobody pushes back, then I'm going to get out of control. And it is my hypothesis that the racial dialogue, not all by any means, but much racial dialogue has gotten out of control, and therefore we feel that even more constrained on the subject of racial speech than we should be. Now, the question is, how do you develop an epistemology of race? How do you know what to do when somebody says something on the subject of race? How do you know whether that person is right or not, particularly in an environment where we privilege identity theory, where we basically say, in a postmodern world, we basically say, there is no truth out there. The truth comes from within, and from within we are all members of individual groups, and we have very little in common. So, for this purpose, I'd like you to look at number 4. This is Randall Kennedy again, professor of law at Harvard. Unless inhibited, every person or group will tend to believe towards beliefs and practices that are self-aggrandizing. This is not only true of those who inherit a dominant status. One of the most striking features of human dynamics is the alacrity with which those who have been oppressed will oppress whomever they can once the opportunity presents itself, right? That's, again, human nature. I push forward, you don't push back. I keep pushing until I oppress you. And so there's a classic line that goes something like, racism is hatred plus power. You must have heard about that. This goes back maybe 15 or 20 years. I haven't heard it recently, and so African Americans can't be racists. Kennedy is really arguing against that point. right? He's saying everybody can be a racist. Everybody pushes and pushes and pushes until somebody pushes back. It doesn't matter whether in a position of power or not in a position of a formal position of power or not. So how do we make these decisions about who to trust and who not to trust? Look at number 5. Richard Delgado is the father of a school of legal analysis called critical race theory. And Mayor Fried told me not too terribly long ago that you offer a course in critical race theory here. Is that correct? Okay, good. So minority status brings with it presumed competence to speak about race and racism. And then we have an Asian American scholar for balance. I would give special credence to the perspective of the subordinated. Okay? Now, my question to you is, you're all law students. Who gets presumptions in their favor under the law in this society, and even outside of the legal system? Do you get a presumption in your favor because of your identity? Or do you get a presumption in your favor for some other reason? There's some special competence that you have, some special training that you have, some special position that you've been appointed to. And I think if you think about it, you'll find there is no presumption based on your identity. Everybody has to earn his or her keep, and a presumption is simply a mistake. Okay? A presumption of competence given to anybody for any reason is a mistake. And so we have a situation where African Americans write about African Americans and whites don't write about African Americans. And what is the consequence of that? Number 7. The view that being a member of a minority group endows one with special insights into its problems has had devastating consequences for the academic study of African American life and intergroup relations. Racism, an undeniable fact for most African Americans, has been for too many the explanation of every problem, the excuse for every failing, the moral whip with which to lash out at anyone who dares to criticize. Let me just mention in passing that my latest article, that hasn't come out yet, is on the Duke rape case. That's a classic example of this, a trigger-happy crowd. I don't know if you all remember, this was 2006. Do all of you remember the Duke rape case? No? Well, maybe I shouldn't talk about it. Okay, it was a very sad story, and if you get in touch with me, I'll be happy to send you an off-print when it comes out. And this was the Duke lacrosse team in 2006, charged by an African-American woman with rape. The faculty ganged up on the students. They were thrown out. They were humiliated. And it turned out the woman had made up the whole thing. There was no evidence whatsoever of any sexual contact between the lacrosse players, and it wrecked the university. But okay, I'll stop there. All right, now let me really to the main point of the talk. So we accept the challenge to speak openly with you. Let's get down to the kind of the principal part of the talk. And I gotta lay a foundation for this. Do any of you, or do all of you know who Richard Sander is? No. Richard Sander is a professor of law at the University of California, Los Angeles. In the year 2004, he wrote an article in the Stanford Law Review on the subject of affirmative action. And he did a huge study on the subject in which he demonstrated, citing some ABA work, the tragic truth that African American students in American law schools are simply not competitive on average. Okay, the whites outperform African American students by a considerable margin on average. Nobody disputes that. What people dispute about Richard Sander, and there's a whole literature on this, is Richard Sander concluded that affirmative action leads to fewer lawyers of color rather than more, because what happens is if African American lawyers, law students are not competitive, they drop out, they're demoralized in school, they don't pass the bar, and they're left high and dry at the end of 3 years. If they went to schools where they were competitive, they'd do perfectly well, and there would be more lawyers. He was attacked and continues to be attacked for this, and probably with good reason. But the point is, for my purposes, is the demonstration of inequality on the part of African American students on average and white students. I hasten to say this is a fundamental problem in American culture, and we got to get a handle on this, and the only way to get a handle on this is to face up to it. Nobody has contradicted that datum. Okay, now, Richard Delgado wrote an article in the Syracuse Law Review in 2007 in which he says, right, presumably accepting Sanders' data, racism at the law schools and in the legal curriculum and sheer economic hardship are equally plausible hypotheses for the low grades of African American law students. When I read that, I knew I had to respond, so I wrote a couple of articles. They're in the 2008-2009 University of San Francisco Law Review, and if you're interested in this, you can look them up there. This talk is really built on that series. There was a series of dialogues between me and Richard Delgado and another academic at the University of San Francisco. Okay, racism at the law schools and the sheer economic hardship are equally plausible hypotheses for the low grades. And so when I go around the country, I talk about this. I ask students, you know, where is the racism in the law schools? Let's face up to the racism in the law schools. And here's what I hear when I ask, and I've asked, let's say 1,000 students, maybe more, over the last couple of years, where's the racism? Well, I couldn't get into a study group that I wanted to, and I think it's because the group that I wanted to join was racist. And I accept that. I certainly accept that as a possibility. I mean, it's speculation. You don't know. And the students, very few students who made this comment to me, seemed to be sincere. And my response to them is, my God, you know, I went to law school. You're in law school. Every single day, you suffer from intellectual inferiority. Maybe it's not the same kind of intellectual inferiority, but I don't think a day passed when I was in law school where I didn't say to myself, that person's smarter than I am. What am I doing here? Or am I going to compete with that person who just read the same case as I did and was a light year ahead of me in understanding the facts of the case? That's simply in the nature of law school, and probably in the nature of of any kind of education. There are going to be people who are smarter one day than you than another, and there are going to be people who are constantly ahead of you, and you're going to have to be cleverer than they are if you're going to outgun them later in life. I don't know how satisfying that explanation was, but that's the only kind of explanation that I heard. I couldn't get into a study group, and I've never heard anybody say anything else. Now, what's wrong with Delgado's position? Racism at the law school are equally plausible hypotheses. If you say there's racism in the law school, and there isn't, then what you're doing is you're taking your eye off the ball. the ball is, how do I improve myself as a law student? Blaming somebody else is not going to be helpful. And so I ask you the same question. If there is racism, and I hope some of you men, talk about this in the question and answer period. If there is racism, if you perceive it or somebody said something, speak up. Now, you might say, well, what's your definition of racism? And so I pull out the dictionary and I say, racism is reflected in Anglo-centric courses and Socratic teaching methods. I'm sorry, I'm skipping, I went to number 10. Racism, a belief or doctrine that inherent differences among the human races determine cultural and individual achievement, usually involving the idea of that one's race is superior. Okay, now that's a dictionary definition and a college dictionary, not even a full dictionary, and I understand there are other definitions. And you probably will say, well, you might think there's unconscious discrimination, there's institutional discrimination, there's intractable discrimination, there's invisible discrimination. But we're law students here, and we're also psychologists. We have to be successful law students, and certainly to be successful practitioners. You have to identify it. And I think it's destructive to make a presumption that there is racism here in a situation where you can't point it out. So again, I challenge you, I always challenge myself, to try to find racism since it is charged as on a regular basis. And you might say, well, that's just one guy, Delgado, but look at the back of your handout. All right, and here's another charge of racism, this by Joe Fagan, a former president of the American Psychological Association, writing a foreword to a book called Reproducing Racism. I'm going to start reading on line 4, if you don't mind. Students of color must regularly endure the great pain of racist events at the law school, and thus are very uncomfortable in these white-normed spaces. Moore, who's the author of the book that this is a preamble to, reveal that students of color must do much emotional work individually and collectively just to survive these settings. Students of color must daily decide whether and how to reject the white racial framing of everyday events. They may disengage in various ways from the law school experience and may choose to fight daily against the racism of their law school space. In either case, great emotional labor is required. All right, so this is an argument, and maybe you'll react and let the rest of us know whether you think there is anything to it. Okay, back to Delgado. Number 10, where is the racism? Racism is in the Anglo-centric courses and Socratic teaching methods, which encourage rapid response and bluffing, Anglo-centric courses. And so what I wrote in my University of San Francisco Law Review article is, what do you want, Professor Delgado? Do you want students to take courses in critical race theory? That's his specialty. If they take courses in critical race theory, will they know telecommunications law? Will they know aviation law? Will they be able to compete with other students who have taken those courses? And if they're not able to compete with other students who have taken those courses, then they're going to be disadvantaged through the curriculum as well as in the other ways that Delgado suggests. So I don't see it. I don't see an idea that we need to develop a separate curriculum for minority students. Everybody has to be able to compete, and with a separate curriculum that will not be possible. Okay, looking again at number 10, Socratic teaching methods. This is an old saw. It is used in feminist theory, and it's used in race theory, that the Socratic method disadvantages women and minorities, particularly African Americans. is absolutely nothing to support the idea. Is there anything to it? I doubt it very much, particularly in the area, maybe with women historically, maybe, but certainly not in the with respect to minorities. African American culture is a culture that's based in a substantial measure, just like white culture, but maybe even a little more than white culture, on wordplay, on hip hop. What could be more rapid response than hip hop? And so how do you argue that African Americans are disadvantaged through a Socratic method? What about bluffing, right, which is the last item on this agenda? Are African Americans less able to bluff than the rest of us in this room? I doubt it. And if you're unsure about that, you might want to take a look at a book called The Race Card: How Bluffing About Bias Makes Race Relations Worse. The author is Richard Thompson Ford, black professor of law at Stanford Law School. So the last thing we want to talk about here, I think, or among the last things, is number 8. I haven't talked about sheer economic hardship. Going back to sheer economic hardship, is that plausible? And I guess the argument there is that African American students being on average, having on average fewer resources than white students, have to work harder outside the school to make money to be able to pay for their legal educations. And it's plausible, but can you say anything beyond that? Is it true? There's absolutely no data on the subject, and so my instinct is to reject it. Now, maybe some of you will take a different position. Okay, so if in fact it is true, as it seems to be, that African American students on average are not competitive with white students, a very painful thought, you might say, well, what's the reason for it? Subotnik hasn't offered a reason for it, and if I haven't offered a reason for it that's more plausible than Delgado's, maybe Delgado is right. And so I want to offer a reason. And for this purpose, I want to cite a book to you, which had an enormous influence on me. The author of the book is John Ogbu, O-G-B-U. John Ogbu was a Nigerian-American anthropologist in the San Francisco area. I think he was at Berkeley. Yeah, he was at Berkeley. He died a number of years ago. And he wrote a book called Black American Students in an Affluent Suburb. Black American Students in an Affluent Suburb. And here's the story with Ogbu, and then I'll give you the details of his book. Ogbu was called by the parents of students in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Shaker Heights, Ohio is a middle to upper middle class neighborhood, fully integrated, one of the really great success stories in many ways in the United States. At the time it was made up of 50% whites and so Ogbu says, and 50% African Americans. Where everybody else is in that picture, I don't know, but that's how Ogbu describes it. So he was called in by the parents because the black students at the school that he calls one of the best in America were terribly frustrated because the black kids were not performing as well as the white kids. So they called him in, they paid for him and his crew to come in and spend a year and study the school system. And here is what Ogbu and his team found, all of which is in his book, came out in 2003. 77% of white students graduated with honors. 2.5% of black students graduated with honors. Blacks made up a very large fraction of the bottom 20% of the class. This is a school that was supposed to be among the best in the United States, according to Ogbu. Here's the tragedy of contemporary American life. We don't know, on average, how to educate our middle class black students. Now, I'm not saying anything about the working class and other classes of black students. Ogbu doesn't measure it. If you want a sense of what's happening there, you might want to look at a series of books by Jonathan Kozol. He tells a terrible story. He's been writing books for the last 30 years, K-O-Z-O-L, on how the lower black classes are disadvantaged, discriminated against with schools that are underperforming by reasons of underfunding and terrible teachers and so on and so forth. And I have nothing to say about that. I just don't know. That's another tragedy. But the tragedy that I'm focusing on is the tragedy of the middle class black students as reflected here. Now, what is Ogbu's solution to the problem? Well, what is his diagnosis? The first thing is, his diagnosis is that it's the parents. The parents are simply not doing what has to be done to advance their kids in school. They have to spend more time. That's his fundamental diagnosis. Nothing about teachers being unprepared, not about teachers favoring one group of students over another, not about administrators favoring one group over one another, not about teachers pushing, having higher expectations, none of that. Now, maybe he was wrong, but we have so few studies around about relative performance across racial lines that you have to take this seriously. I look for more. I'm always on the look. My librarian knows I'll do anything to find data that's more current than this, but you can't. And one of the reasons is this data is so terribly painful. And I think what happens is we don't really want to know. I called up, not long ago, in the spring, I called up the Shaker Heights school system and I said, what's going on? There was this terrible report 10 years ago. What are you doing about it? Nothing. Couldn't get any information about what they were doing about it, and no data more current than 2000 data. All right, so now, how might we explain at least some of the gap? Well, there's a professor of education at Harvard by the name of Ron Ferguson, who is black, who's written on the subject, of Shaker Heights, Ohio. And he found that 41% of the gap can be tied to the higher educational levels of the white parents. So 41%, that's a lot, but that leaves 59%. What about that 59%? And he offered no solution to what the cause of that 59% gap might be. So we just don't have good answers at this point. We're still scrambling for answers. And Amy Wax is somebody who's tried her hand at understanding the problem. Amy Wax is a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania. And don't worry, I'm wrapping this up, folks. I know it's late in the day. Amy Wax wrote a book a couple of years ago called Rights, Wrongs, and Remedies. rights, wrongs, and remedies. And here's what she says. She says that in our society, we are used to a measure of damages which is working at cross purposes with the needs of American society. Then when you take a torts class and you hear that somebody is injured and they're out of work for 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, they're entitled to be put back in the same position that they would have been. They're entitled to 2 years of pay for your negligence. We're entitled to be put back in the same position. And what she says is what's happening in the United States is that the injury to our African American population was so great through slavery that that's not a useful measure of compensation. It's not a useful measure of recovery. That we should think of slavery as something, and Jim Crow and its aftermath, we should think of all of these things as some form of deep tissue injury. Not loss of wages, but deep tissue injury. And if we think of it in those terms, we might be able to get somewhere. And what happens when you've got a deep tissue injury? The problem is there is no monetary damage remedy for that. The remedy is for the injured person to do the hard work of rehabilitation. And there's no substitute for the hard work of rehabilitation in these circumstances. Well, why can't we say that? We can't say it, she says, because of an axiom that we have, and that's blaming the victim. You can't tell the victim that the victim has to do this rehabilitation work, because then you're blaming the victim for the injury to the victim. And the result is, nobody says what has to be said. Now, one of the people who tried to make that point a few years ago was Bill Cosby. You may not recall this. Bill Cosby came out at a convention of, I don't remember, I think it was really African American dignitaries, and he made a comment about how the underclasses, the working and underclasses in the black community were simply dysfunctional. They were not teaching their children to speak proper English. They were wallowing in ebonics. They were teaching their kids to wear their trousers down by their knees, and they were not preparing kids for a competitive economic life. He got creamed by some. He was wildly cheered by part of the black community, but he got creamed among academics. One of the academics that creamed him in a book that was just disgusting, disgraceful, was Michael Eric Dyson, who wrote a whole book on the subject of Bill Cosby. And, is Bill Cosby right? And he said no, and he talked about Bill Cosby's personal life. It was a disgraceful response to a challenge that had received very favorable attention from the audience and from other parts of the black middle class. I'm telling you this because I think there's some good news at the end of the story. I did say at the beginning of my talk that I think we should all be frank with one another. And here I'm going to pull back. If you're interested in this subject, I think you will get an optimistic read from comments that President Obama made to the Congressional Black Caucus last week. I don't feel comfortable reading these comments to you. This is mostly a Caucasian audience, and I don't feel comfortable reading a comment made by the president to the Congressional Black Caucus. He got wild applauses for comments that were similar to the comments made by Bill Cosby. And that suggests to me that maybe we've turned a corner here. I hope so. Thank you for your attention. Yes, sir.
Yeah, a couple things. I thought
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting that in point 7,
Yeah.
it starts off by saying the view that being a member of a minority group endows one with special insights into its problems has had devastating consequences for the academic study of African American life and intergroup relations.
Yeah.
And then, I guess when you go into mention each one of these particular people, you happen to mention their particular race as if that should give them some sort of extra credibility.
Good point. And you're right. You're right, there's a contradiction there. And I would say, my only response is there for some people in the audience, that means a lot. To me, it means something. But it means something, but I think other people give it more credibility, and I use it for persuasive purposes. But I agree with you. You're right on target. There's a contradiction there. Yes, did you want to say something else? I'm sorry.
I actually have a few more points, but I'll let some other people speak first.
You want to?
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a comment.
I can let him go. Wait.
It's just a couple different things.
Go ahead.
And again, this is not as organized because I didn't have time to prepare a speech and deliver it about 30 times. But in terms of just like different books and things that,
Yeah.
I guess you said there's a couple different things that you happen to see that you're not really sure where to go to find, different answers that might shed some light on it. One quick thing, which is actually written to the layperson, so pretty much anyone can understand it. If you ever see one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, either Blink
I have.
or Outliers, they're actually kind of helpful in terms of thinking about some of the different ways that particular minority groups within a particular society happen to start to internalize feelings based on things that they happen to see in the media and news every single day.
Okay.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be outright racism, but there are different things that happen, really small things that happen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times.
And any particular book? I mean, I've read one of his books.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Malcolm Gladwell, one of them is called Blink,
Blink. Okay.
and the other one is called Outliers.
Yeah, I think I read Outliers, but I didn't read Blink. Okay.
Blink, you're referring to the study with where people pick and they pick white over black fast or in almost all situations.
Right. There's a particular study that's done where essentially you have to associate black or white with either good or bad things.
Oh, I've seen those studies. Yes, I have read those studies.
Right.
Okay. No, and bear in mind, my focus is on the law school. That was the title. It's on the law school, not on the larger society. Now, if you say, and I've heard this before, and it's no less valid because it's been said before, well, isn't it true that what's outside is going to get carried inside? We have people coming from the outside inside, and I'm saying, yes, it is true, but maybe we're more sensitive here. Maybe. In any event, it would be nice for somebody to say, it happened to me, right? These are things are called microaggressions, I think, in the psychological literature. And I'm suffering from, or I suffered from this microaggression. So you're not wrong, but I'd like to see this come out, because I think there is something of a cocoon in law school. We work hard at it. I think every law school in the country, not every law school, but most law schools work hard at it. We try to do what we can to eliminate those microaggressions. Whether we're successful, you guys can tell it. You guys can help shed light on it.
Right. And one other point that happened to be mentioned, I believe, in Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, again, it's a great book, I think you should check it out, was that at a particular point, judging people based specifically on a numerical value has its worth. But at a certain point, people just have to be good enough in order to do something. For instance, to win a Nobel Prize, to get into law school, to succeed at sports, different things. And there was an actual study that came out, I believe it was by University of Michigan, and I could be wrong about this.
I know about that.
Where they actually said that after the minority law students had actually graduated, a lot of them were just as successful, if not more successful, as their white counterparts.
Good point, and you should all know about this. I'm so glad you mentioned it. The subject is the relevance of grades to success. Richard Sander wrote a book, an article, or a review article, saying grades tie most closely to success. And I forgot how he measured success. The counter argument is by a guy at the University of Michigan by the name of Richard Lempert. He wrote with 3 other people, L-E-M-P-E-R-T, who showed that for a large fraction of the class at the University of Michigan, there was no connection between success, and I don't remember how he measured it either. I meant to look up those articles again. Success and grades in school. So I'm with you. We need much more work.
I'm sorry. Like,
No,
not
go ahead.
to hog it, but just one final point. I think it's a little disingenuous to simply try to look at law school as a microcosm and not look at how people managed to get there. Not look at necessarily what they had access to in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, who their parents happen to be. I think the fact that you mentioned that, I believe it was in Ron Ferguson's work, that
Yeah.
41% of the educational gap
Yeah.
between blacks and whites could be attributed to parents' educational thing. That might not seem like a majority, but 41% is actually
Oh,
a
I
pretty
agree.
significant number.
I agree. On the other hand, I'm convinced that if you say that a student is disadvantaged, that parents who graduated from college cannot produce kids who are successful as parents graduating from graduate school, I get very depressed. Because I like to think that you get to a certain level and you should be teaching your kids to read, and it doesn't matter whether you have a graduate degree or not. And what he was saying in this study is that the parents had, in effect, because this was almost entirely a college-educated crowd here in Shaker Heights. Those parents were professionals. They had higher degrees, and I hate to think, maybe it's true, that there are advantages. The more education you have, the greater your ability to transmit the academic values to your kids. But if we're ever going to make real progress, we're going to have to get beyond that.
That's difficult for you to grasp that idea that
No.
the education level.
No, it's not difficult for me to grasp. On the other hand, no. What I'm suggesting, it's not difficult for me to grasp. What I know is that for huge numbers of the immigrant classes over the generations in the United States, right, the leap was quick, right? You had people who were ignorant and their kids became psychiatrists.
Are you saying ignorant or immigrants?
Immigrants. There were people who had no education and came here over on the boats, and the tie between education level of the parent and education level achieved by the kids was not what it is now. Now, and I hate the idea that this has become concrete, if it has, and I don't know if it has. But Ron Ferguson says, to some extent, 41% is a lot. You're right. To some extent, it has to do with the educational level of the parent. But we're never really going to get parity if we say, okay, that's the way it is. Right? The kids of the college-educated crowd have to be able to do as well as the kids of the graduate level parents.
That's also addressed in Harper Blackwood's book.
It is? Okay, I'll take it. Thank you. Somebody else?
I'm just gonna have to kind of disagree with you about the level of education that a parent has corresponding significantly with how the success of their child.
Mm-hmm.
I may be not qualified to talk about this because I am an Asian immigrant from Canada, where racism is not nearly as big of a problem. But there are many studies done within Canada about why Asian immigrant families, their child constantly outperform children from other cultures, all other cultures, and one of the significant influences how much time their parents devote on the children's education. Now, it may not be that the family have to be higher educated, but what's important is the parents must place their kids' education at like paramount importance. I know when my experience growing up was, my education was their most important thing, that they're willing to sacrifice everything else to ensure that my studies are up to date and I am keeping up with schoolwork. Now, maybe I'm being a little ignorant here. I don't feel the same importance placed with other cultures compared to Asian cultures. Asians seem to place an especially important role on their kids' education, more so than other cultures. So I think maybe this is a question of value.
Well, Ogbu says that. Ogbu says it's a question of value to the extent that his diagnosis is the African American parents were not emphasizing education, pushing their kids enough relative to the white parents. That's his primary message. Now, I can't respond to the cross-cultural message. I just don't know enough. But it's certainly plausible. Yes, sir.
So you make the analogy of like the deep tissue injury and the need for rehabilitation,
Yeah.
and that the victims themselves should go out and fix themselves. But at the end of the day, doesn't rehabilitation itself cost a substantial amount of money? Right? To go to a physical therapist to get rehabilitated costs a lot of money. So where's the money that should be coming in to then help rehabilitate these victims?
Well, okay, and
Especially when you talk about the failing school system, and then we often find in inner cities it's probably contributing to the lack of education.
yes, you're right. If you think about what's going on in Congress now, there's a big discussion about this. Newt Gingrich made the point just a couple of weeks ago, and there's something to it. He was asked, I think, one of the presidential debates. He was asked about increasing the term for unemployment benefits, and he said something like, "I don't believe in giving people benefits for not doing anything. I'm happy to push for increasing unemployment benefits after 2 years if people subject themselves to training for new jobs." So there's some recognition out there that it's going to take money, and some, right? I think some commitment to spend the money, where it looks like the effort is going to be put up, the investment is going to be put up.
Any other comments?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you also mentioned the hard work of rehabilitation. I guess, kind of going off of your point, doesn't it involve a lot of other people to rehabilitate the individual who's the victim? So I guess the question is, how does that?
Well, I'm not saying this has to be done by the African community itself. I'm saying we're all in this together. But what I most object to, though, is to say, is the argument that it is white racism that is doing the dirty work of keeping African American law students down. And by extension, and I don't know how far this extends because I've only studied the law school environment. By extension, colleges generally. And I've never heard the NAACP talk, for example, about single parenthood in the black community. Never. Now, maybe they have, but I've never heard about it. There are a lot of data showing that single parenthood hurts kids a lot, particularly boys. A lot of data. Although it's interesting, there's a new book out on the subject, let's see, Is Marriage for White People? I don't know if you heard about this, by a guy at Stanford, a black professor at Stanford, in which he said, and this is only talked about tangentially, in in which he says that there is one study that shows that single parenthood in the black community has no effect on the education of the kids. But for most of the studies, most of the general studies show a substantial price that is paid for boys, especially boys who grow up in single parent households. So that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see a recognition, that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see a recognition that the black community stands up and says, we gotta take care of this. There are large elements of the black community that already do it, that already does that, but there are a lot of people who are afraid to stand up. It's blaming the victim again.
Certainly the black community understands that single parenthood is not the ideal way to raise children, and I guess singling, it sounds a little bit odd to me that the NAACP has never addressed that
I
issue,
have
and
never seen it.
I find that a little bit hard to believe. Further, other organizations, certainly the NAACP is not represented.
No, that's right, you're right.
So there are certainly other organizations that do understand that and have.
When I read the academic literature, I see no reference to that. The academic literature, almost without exception, blames Caucasian society for the educational problems of African American students.
And you think that a lot of the problems are not attributed to?
Oh, I think some are. And that is to say, there is that, you know, the Jonathan Kozol school, I mentioned Jonathan Kozol, who writes about the terrible conditions of the urban schools. That's a terrible problem. But we don't, but we have no handle on what to do about it. It's a tragedy. There are a few isolated schools that seem to be doing a good job. I think one in Chicago, a couple in New York, but nothing on a systematic basis. All kinds of experimentation are going on. And I think there's some progress, but it's minuscule.
So I guess you'd like to see what then to improve this?
No, what I think is, I would like to see more people like Obama stand up and say, hey, come on, folks, and I don't want to repeat what Obama said. Please look it up. I mean, if you're interested in this subject, a week ago, to the Congressional Black Caucus.
Sure, but doesn't some of the responsibility fall on the society?
It does, and I don't deny that. It's got to be in partnership.
Well,
but the partnership cannot start. The partnership cannot start if significant elements of the black community are saying it's racism.
Sure, and the partnership cannot start also if significant elements of society as a whole, which I'm going to, generally call white society, which is American society, if they don't recognize some of the issues and problems.
I agree with you.
Because the power is in white society, not in black society. So it's really difficult for the underclass that I'm going to generalize and say black society to, pull themselves up by the bootstraps and kind of rise up without this partnership and a true commitment from.
And I agree with you.
So I guess my question is, you're offering, a partial solution and wanting a recognition from the black community that, for example, single parenthood is tragic.
Yes.
But that is only also a small part of it. So I guess the question is, what are you offering from, or what are you asking for the other side, the white society, generally to
I'm asking for a partnership, okay? And I'm suggesting that as long as there are people like Delgado saying racism is everything. Let me finish.
Racism is everything.
Well, he's saying it's everything, and other people are saying it also.
The majority of people, scholars and academics, do not, and black people, and I'm not going to speak for all black people, but certainly we understand that racism is not everything. Some people might say that, but of course, the general society, certainly academic or black academics, don't believe that racism is everything.
Okay.
That'd be a silly notion.
That's good. I'm glad to hear it.
And I think think part of the reason that, I mean, Obama's message happened to resonate so well, I mean, like, even in the room of the actual Congressional Black Caucus
Yeah.
throughout the nation,
Yeah.
is because that's the same exact message that people hear every single Sunday if they happen to go to a black church. It's not something new, like, people
Okay,
don't realize.
It's not new, but for a political leader, that was impressive. It was dangerous, it was courageous, it was impressive.
Right, but you weren't mentioning it as a political leader saying it, you were mentioning it as one black person who happens to be in a position of power, saying it to the rest of the black community.
So sorry guys, but actually we are out